Welcome! My name is Veronica Atherton. In our last video, we learned about Solomon's ungodly alliances with foreign kings and about his choice to use forced labor among the Israelites when building the temple and his palaces. In this video, in this teaching, we will be studying a little bit more about those construction projects, the temple and Solomon's palace. We'll be looking at 1 Kings chapter 6 through 8 as we do so. Now in chapters 6 and 7, we get a big detailed picture of what the temple looked like as they built it. God's covenant with David concerning the temple would require obedience on Solomon's part. And it seems that Solomon must agree to these terms because he continues building. And the temple was filled with symbols which represented God's provision for his people, his provision of the promised land, and reminding the people of their history of following God. Then in chapter 8, Solomon then dedicated the temple. The priests brought in the Ark of the Covenant, and as they placed it in the Holy of Holies, the presence and glory of God filled the temple so that the priests had to leave and could not re-enter the holy place in the temple. And then Solomon gave speeches and prayers to dedicate the temple, and he presented burnt offerings to the Lord there. I think it can be very easy for us to get blinded by Solomon's glory and power and wisdom and the fact that he was allowed to build the temple. We can miss, because of all that Solomon's not really one of the heroes of the Bible. He is not one of our great pillars of faith like Abraham or Moses or even his father David. Throughout Solomon's life, his power and wealth, it led his heart away from God. It made him proud and made him think that he did not need to be as dedicated to God. Now, as we read about what the temple looked like, we see that Solomon seems to have spared no expense and poured out his riches to build this. And at first, this might make us see dedication to God. But as we read closely, we see that even though it is only mentioned briefly, Solomon's own palace, which he built after the temple, was 4.5 times the size of the footprint of the temple. And that is only his own palace, not to mention the palace he built just for his wife, the princess and daughter of Pharaoh. He also built more and more palaces for his many other wives to live in. He acted on behalf of his own interests and sought his own power, wealth, and glory. In Solomon's speech in 1 Kings chapter 8, he announces, "I have surely built you a lofty house, a place for your dwelling forever," showing us that he is thinking about building the temple as one of his mighty accomplishments. He's not thinking of all of it as a joint effort, as a people's offering to their Lord. No, he thinks of it as his own accomplishment. God tells David, "No, you won't build a house for me. I will build a house for you." And then he tells him of a coming king who is greater. And Solomon fails to recognize that there could be a king who is coming, who is greater even than Solomon in all his wealth and splendor. That there could be a coming king who is greater. And we see in Luke 11 and in Matthew 12, Jesus points out that he is this coming king who is greater than even Solomon in his wealth and glory. Now, despite all this, God chooses to redeem the temple as well. Remember, in chapter 8, we read that the glory of the Lord filled the temple, and the cloud of the Lord filled the Holy of Holies, such that the priest could not enter to minister to God because the cloud was so thick. And we read that God was there. We see God chose to work with what his people had done for him, despite that it was not his intent for them. Ultimately, in this section, we see a nation who missed the point, and a king who missed the point as well. And what God desires most from us is not some big ornate temple like what people build for false and pagan gods. No, what God wants most from all of us, his people, is for our hearts to be fully dedicated to him.